You are not even worth explaining yourself.
That has never been my job.
Take your hand off that jacket, the old man said, his voice low and steady, not loud enough to command the room but somehow strong enough to stop the nearest glass mid-lift, and for a fraction of a second the entire bar seemed to hesitate, like something unseen had just shifted beneath the floorboards, but Ryan Voss didn't let go, his grip firm around the worn fabric as he leaned in closer. The faint smell of bourbon and leather hanging between them, his jaw tight with the kind of confidence that came from years of being right and never being questioned, or what? He asked quietly, almost amused, because to him this was already over, just another washed-up story waiting to unravel, another old man clinging to something he hadn't earned, and behind him his team adjusted without speaking, subtle steps, quiet repositioning, a practiced formation that closed the space without drawing attention, one by the door, one near the hallway, two flanking just far enough back to watch. Everything, control everything, the kind of movement that didn't belong to civilians, and the bartender noticed it, her hands slowing against the counter as the towel dragged across polished wood, her eyes flicking once toward the old man and then away again because something about the air felt wrong now, heavier, like a storm that hadn't broken yet, and still the old man didn't move, not really. Just a slight tightening of his fingers where they rested near the edge of the bar, knuckles pale against weathered skin, his posture unchanged, shoulders slightly hunched, weight uneven on one leg, the limp obvious if you looked long enough, but there was no weakness in the way he held himself, only stillness, deliberate and complete, the kind of stillness that didn't ask for space but somehow took it anyway, and Ryan misread it, like men always did. He saw hesitation, saw doubt, saw confirmation of what he already believed. You don't get to wear something like this and just sit there. He continued, his voice sharpening now, no longer casual, men bled for less than that, and a quiet murmur passed through the room, not agreement, not disagreement, just awareness, because people were watching now even if they pretended not to, and the old man exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible but carrying weight, like it had been pulled from somewhere far away. Somewhere older than this moment. It's not for you, he said, and that should have ended it, that should have been enough, but Ryan stepped closer instead, closing the last inch of space, testing, always testing, his hand shifting from the jacket to something tucked just beneath it, a thin piece of worn plastic, edges cracked, corners softened from years of being carried, and he pulled it free without asking, holding it up between two fingers, turning it slightly under the dim bar lights. What is this? He asked, a smirk forming as he glanced back at his team, expecting a laugh, expecting validation, but none came this time, just silence, subtle but real, because something about the object didn't fit the joke, it wasn't decorative, it wasn't meant to be seen, and for the first time the old man moved with intention, his hand rising not fast but exact, stopping just short of Ryan's wrist, not grabbing, not forcing, just there, close enough to matter, and when he spoke again his voice dropped even lower, rough like gravel dragged across steel. You shouldn't have taken that, and Ryan felt it then, just for a second, a flicker he couldn't name, something that didn't match the script in his head, but he pushed past it, because that's what men like him did, they pressed forward, they finished what they started. Relax, he said, turning the card over, scanning it, and then pausing, not long, just enough to register confusion, because there was no name on it, no unit, no insignia he recognized, just a faded frequency code and a call sign partially scratched out, and before he could speak again, before he could decide what it meant or didn't mean, the old man's eyes lifted fully to meet his, clear and steady and impossibly calm, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them, something that didn't belong in a bar on a quiet night, something older, heavier, and far more final than Ryan understood, and across the room the bartender had already turned away, her hand reaching beneath the counter toward a number she had never used, because whatever was about to happen next, she knew one thing with absolute certainty, they had just taken something they were never meant to touch. Ryan Voss turned the card once more between his fingers, the faint overhead light catching along the cracked surface, and for the first time since he had stepped into the old man's space there was hesitation, small but undeniable, a pause that did not belong to him, because nothing about the object fit the narrative he had already decided was true, no rank, no unit, no insignia to challenge or dismiss, just a frequency code worn nearly smooth and a fragment of a call sign that looked like it had been deliberately scratched away. And behind him one of his men shifted, just a fraction of a step, close enough to be felt but not seen, the kind of adjustment that came from instinct rather than thought, and the room picked up on it, conversations thinning further, the quiet deepening into something more deliberate, more focused, because now it was no longer just a confrontation, it was a moment waiting to reveal what it really was, and Ryan forced a small laugh that did not quite land, shaking his head as if clearing something that had no right to be there. "You expect me to believe this means something?" he said, though his voice had lost a degree of its earlier edge, and the old man did not answer right away, his gaze fixed not on the card but on Ryan himself, studying him in a way that felt less like being challenged and more like being measured, and somewhere in that silence the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the bar seemed louder, the clink of ice in a glass across the room sharper, every small sound stretching against the tension that had settled in place. "It is not for belief," the old man said finally, his voice even, controlled, "it is for those who know," and the words landed differently than anything he had said before, not defensive, not dismissive, just certain, and that certainty pressed against Ryan in a way he could not immediately explain, because it did not ask for agreement, it did not require understanding, it simply existed, and that was harder to push against than anything else, and one of the operators behind him leaned in slightly, close enough for Ryan to hear without turning. "That code," the man murmured, barely audible, "it is not standard," and Ryan frowned, his grip tightening slightly on the card as he looked again, slower this time, noticing details he had ignored before, the spacing of the numbers, the format of the lettering, the absence of anything that would place it inside the systems he knew, and across the bar the bartender had already stepped away from the counter, her movements quiet, deliberate, disappearing into the back without drawing attention, because whatever this was it had moved beyond something she could interrupt directly. And back at the stool the old man shifted his weight just enough to settle more firmly, his hand returning to the edge of the bar. Fingers relaxed now, no longer reaching, no longer warning, as if a line had already been crossed and there was no need to stop it anymore, and Ryan felt that shift even if he could not name it, the sense that the moment had turned in a direction he had not chosen, and still he pressed, because backing off now would mean admitting something he was not ready to admit. "You are going to explain this," he said. Quieter now but more controlled, and the old man's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did, something older, something that did not belong to the room or the time or the men standing around him, and when he spoke again it was softer than before, almost a warning, almost a memory. "No," he said, "I am not," and that should have ended it, but instead it deepened the silence, stretched it until it felt like the entire room was holding its breath, and outside, unnoticed by anyone inside, a pair of headlights turned slowly into the parking lot, cutting through the dark with a steady, deliberate approach that did not belong to chance. The headlights did not rush, they did not flare or sweep wide across the front of the building, they simply approached with a steady, deliberate pace, cutting through the dark parking lot like they already knew exactly where they were going, and inside the bar no one noticed at first because all attention remained fixed on the quiet standoff at the counter, Ryan Voss still holding the worn card between his fingers, his posture rigid now not from dominance but from something far less familiar. Uncertainty that had not yet found a name, and behind him his team felt it too, the subtle shift in control that no one had acknowledged out loud, one of them glancing briefly toward the door before forcing his focus back, because whatever this was it had already moved beyond something simple, and at the bar the old man remained exactly where he was, one hand resting near the glass, the other still and relaxed, no tension left in his fingers, no urgency in his posture, as if the outcome of this moment had already been decided somewhere far outside of it, and that realization pressed against Ryan in a way he could not shake. "You think this is some kind of game?" he asked, quieter now, his voice no longer carrying across the room but contained, controlled, directed only at the man in front of him, and the old man did not answer immediately, his eyes lowering briefly to the card still in Ryan's hand before returning, steady, unblinking. "No," he said, and the single word settled heavier than anything that had come before it, because it carried no challenge, no resistance, only certainty, and that certainty made the space between them feel narrower, tighter, like something was closing in without movement, and Ryan swallowed that feeling, pushing forward again because it was the only direction he knew. "Then explain it," he pressed, holding the cart slightly higher now, as if elevation alone would force meaning from it, but the old man only shook his head once, slow, deliberate, final. "Some things are not explained," he said, and that was when the door opened, not violently, not abruptly, just enough to let in a strip of cool night air that carried with it the faint sound of engines idling outside, low and controlled, and for the first time the room reacted as a whole, not turning fully but shifting, attention pulling toward the entrance in small, cautious glances, because something about that sound did not belong to coincidence, and one of Ryan's men noticed it clearly, his stance tightening as he looked toward the door, then back at Ryan, then at the old man, connecting something he could not fully articulate, and Ryan followed that look, just briefly, just enough to register the change, the presence outside that had not been there before, and when he turned back the old man was already watching him, not with anticipation, not with satisfaction, but with the same calm awareness he had held from the beginning, and that was when it settled in fully, not as a thought but as a realization that did not require words, that whatever this situation was, it was no longer his to control, and outside the engines did not cut, they remained running, steady, patient, as if whoever had arrived had no intention of leaving quickly, and inside the bar the silence deepened again, heavier now, more defined, as every second stretched just a little longer than the one before it, and Ryan felt it, that shift in weight, that invisible line he had crossed without seeing it, and for the first time since he had stepped up to the old man he did not speak immediately, because something told him that whatever came next was not going to be decided by him at all. The door did not slam, it opened with a controlled push that carried no urgency and yet commanded attention in a way noise never could, and the moment it moved every conversation that had been pretending to continue finally stopped, not all at once but in fragments, voices cutting off mid-sentence, glasses hovering just short of the table, because something about the presence beyond that threshold did not belong to the rhythm of a normal night, and Ryan Voss felt it before he fully turned, the subtle shift in the room aligning with the steady pulse of the engine still idling outside, and when his eyes finally moved toward the entrance he did not see uniforms, he did not see flashing lights, he saw 6 men in plain clothes stepping in with quiet precision, their movements measured, coordinated without appearing rehearsed, the kind of motion that came from years of working in spaces where hesitation carried consequences. And they did not scan the room like newcomers, they assessed it in a single pass, dismissing everything that did not matter until their focus landed exactly where it needed to, at the bar, at the line that had been drawn without anyone acknowledging it, and behind Ryan one of his operators straightened instinctively, shoulders pulling back, posture tightening in recognition that came before thought, and another shifted his weight, no longer relaxed, no longer in control, because whatever had just entered the room did not answer to them, and Ryan felt that realization settle in before he fully understood it, a quiet pressure building at the edge of his awareness, and he turned back toward the old man for just a second, as if expecting something to change, but nothing had. The man remained exactly as he had been, seated, still, his hand resting near the glass, his gaze steady, not on the door, not on the men entering, but on Ryan himself, as if everything unfolding had already been accounted for, and that was when the footsteps reached the bar, soft, controlled, stopping just behind the semicircle Ryan and his team had formed, and no one announced themselves, no one needed to, because the shift in presence alone was enough, and one of the newcomers stepped forward, just one, his movement drawing a clean line through the tension without breaking it, and when he spoke his voice was calm, even, but carried a weight that did not ask for attention, it took it. "Release the card," he said, not loud, not aggressive, simply stated as if there were no alternative outcome, and Ryan did not move immediately, not out of defiance but because his mind was still catching up to what his instincts had already accepted, that control had shifted, that the space he had owned minutes ago no longer belonged to him, and he glanced briefly at his team, searching for confirmation, for reinforcement, but what he found instead were faces that had gone still in a different way, not confident, not relaxed, but alert, measured, recognizing something he had not yet named, and slowly, almost without deciding to, Ryan lowered his hand slightly, the worn card still between his fingers, and looked back at the man who had spoken, trying to place him, trying to understand the authority that did not need to be displayed, and before he could form the question the man's attention moved past him, not dismissive, not ignoring, but redirecting entirely, focusing on the old man at the bar, and in that moment the entire room seemed to narrow to a single point. Because whatever was about to happen next was no longer about accusation or explanation, it was about recognition, and Ryan felt it fully now, the quiet certainty that the line he had crossed was not one he could step back over on his own. Ryan Voss did not remember deciding to move, but the card was no longer raised at chest level, it had lowered just enough to break the line of control he had been holding onto, and in that small motion the balance in the room shifted completely, not dramatically, not visibly, but with a finality that everyone present could feel even if they could not explain it, and the man who had stepped forward did not repeat himself, he did not need to, because the expectation had already been set. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Ryan understood that this was no longer a situation he could manage with pressure or presence, this was something else entirely, something structured, something precise, and slowly, with a control that felt unfamiliar, he extended his hand and let the worn card rest back onto the bar between himself and the old man, and no one reached for it immediately, not the man who had arrived, not the old man, because the object itself was no longer the focus, what it represented had already taken its place, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was dense, carrying weight that pressed into every corner of the room, and then the man who had spoken shifted his stance, a subtle adjustment that aligned him squarely in front of the old man, his posture straightening not out of tension but out of recognition, and when he spoke again his voice changed, not in volume but in tone, the edge of command replaced with something quieter, something deliberate. "Sir," he said, and that single word moved through the room like a current, because it reframed everything in an instant, not as a correction, not as a challenge, but as acknowledgement, and Ryan felt it hit harder than any confrontation could have, because it removed him from the center of the moment entirely, and for a fraction of a second no one else breathed, the air holding still as the old man finally moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to reach forward and rest his fingers lightly on the edge of the card, drawing it back toward him with a calm, practiced motion, as if returning it to a place it had always belonged, and when his hands settled, the man in front of him did something that no one in the room had anticipated, not because it was impossible, but because it did not fit the story they had all been constructing in their heads. He stepped back half a pace, squared his shoulders, and came to a complete, precise stillness, and then, with no hesitation and no excess motion, he raised his hand in a clean, controlled salute, the gesture sharp, exact, and held without wavering, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not explosive, but absolute, the kind of silence that did not just fill a room but defined it, and Ryan felt something drop in his chest, a realization forming faster than he could process it, because the hierarchy he understood, the structure he trusted, had just rearranged itself in front of him without warning, and behind him one of his men exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible but heavy with recognition, and still the salute remained, unbroken, unwavering, directed not at rank displayed or authority declared, but at the quiet figure seated on a worn bar stool, and the old man looked at it, not surprised, not uncomfortable, just aware, as if it were something he had seen before, something he had carried long after others had forgotten, and when he spoke his voice was steady. "Unchanged, you should not have come," he said, and the man lowered his hand only after a brief pause, his expression composed but firm, "With respect, sir, we were already too late," and those words settled into the space like a final piece falling into place, because whatever this moment was, whatever this man represented, it had never been about proving anything, it had only ever been about who recognized it, and who did not. The words did not echo, they settled, low and deliberate, carrying more weight than the raised voices that had filled the room minutes earlier, and Ryan Voss stood there without moving, his hands now empty, his posture no longer projecting control but holding still as his mind worked to catch up with what had already happened, because nothing about this aligned with the rules he had trusted, the patterns he had relied on, and yet the evidence was right in front of him, a man he had dismissed without hesitation now standing at the center of a silence that no one dared to break, and the man who had arrived remained composed, his presence steady, his attention fixed entirely on the old man as if nothing else in the room held relevance, and when he spoke again it was quieter, almost measured. "We received the flag within 30 seconds, he said, not explaining but stating. Each word placed carefully, there was no ambiguity, and Ryan felt that sentence land in a way he could not ignore, because systems like that did not move without cause, they did not escalate without reason, and whatever had triggered that response had come from the small object he had just returned, and for the first time he understood that what he had been holding was not a token, not a relic, but a signal, and that realization carried with it a weight that pressed against his chest, forcing him to reassess everything that had led to this moment, and behind him one of his operators shifted again, not to reposition but to stand straighter, his eyes no longer scanning the room but fixed forward, recognition now fully formed, and another lowered his gaze briefly, the subtle gesture of someone recalibrating their place within a hierarchy that had just been revealed to be deeper than they had assumed. And the old man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, his posture still grounded, as if the information did not surprise him, as if it confirmed something he had already known would happen, and when he spoke his voice carried the same calm restraint. It was not meant to be used, he said, and the man in front of him nodded once, acknowledging without questioning. Understood, sir, he replied, and that exchange, brief and precise, carried more meaning than any explanation could have, because it implied a history that did not need to be spoken aloud, a structure that existed beyond the visible chain of command, and Ryan felt the distance between himself and that structure more clearly than ever, not as exclusion but as awareness, the realization that there were layers to the world he operated in that he had never touched, and the room seemed to hold that understanding collectively, no longer tense in the same way, but quieter, more focused, as if everyone present had stepped back from something they had almost interfered with, and the bartender reappeared at the edge of the room, her movements slower now, more deliberate, watching without interrupting, because whatever was unfolding had reached a point where interference was no longer possible, and the man who had arrived shifted slightly, turning his head just enough to acknowledge Ryan and his team for the first time, his gaze steady, not hostile, not dismissive, but firm. In a way that left no room for misinterpretation, and Ryan met that look without speaking, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend, only the quiet acceptance that he had stepped into something he did not understand and had been stopped before it could go further, and when the man turned back to the old veteran his voice lowered again. "We will handle the rest," he said, and the old man gave a small nod, not granting permission but acknowledging the inevitability of it. And in that moment the entire room seemed to release a breath it had been holding, the tension easing not because the situation was resolved, but because its true shape had finally been revealed, and Ryan remained where he was, still and silent, understanding now that the moment he thought he controlled had never belonged to him at all. No one moved to leave, not immediately, because the moment had not released them yet. It held the room in place with a quiet authority that did not require instruction, and Ryan Voss remained where he stood, his shoulders squared out of habit but no longer carrying the same weight, his attention fixed not on the man who had arrived but on the old veteran seated in front of him, trying to reconcile the image he had formed minutes ago with the reality now standing unmistakably before him, and the gap between those two things was wider than anything he had encountered before, because it was not just a mistake of judgment, it was a failure to recognize something fundamental, something that had been present the entire time without announcing itself, and behind him his team had fully shifted now, no longer forming a barrier, no longer holding position, their stance relaxed but not casual, attentive in a different way, as if they had stepped back into a role that required observation rather than control, and the man who had entered the bar remained composed, his posture unchanged, his presence still commanding without effort, and he gave a small nod to the others who had come with him, a subtle signal that required no explanation, and they responded in kind, adjusting slightly, not surrounding, not enclosing, but positioning themselves in a way that ensured space was maintained around the old man, not to contain him but to protect the boundary that had already been drawn, and the distinction was clear to anyone paying attention, and Ryan saw it now, saw the difference between control and respect, between dominance and recognition, and it settled in with a weight that did not need to be spoken, and for a moment no one said anything, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to prove, only the quiet understanding that something significant had been revealed without spectacle. And then Ryan took a step forward, not aggressively, not to reclaim space, but because standing still felt like avoidance now, and when he spoke his voice was different, still steady but stripped of the earlier certainty. "Sir," he said, the word coming more naturally than he expected, and it carried no hesitation, no performance, just acknowledgement, and the old man turned his head slightly, enough to meet his gaze again, and in that look there was no judgment, no lingering offense, Just awareness, the same calm presence that had been there from the beginning, and Ryan held that gaze for a second longer than necessary before continuing. "I misread the situation," he said, each word deliberate, not an excuse, not an explanation, just a statement of fact, and the room seemed to absorb that just as it had everything else, quietly, without reaction, and the old man gave a small nod, not approving, not dismissing, simply accepting the words as they were offered. And that was enough, more than enough, and Ryan felt something shift internally. Not relief, not exactly, but clarity, the kind that came from understanding a boundary that had always existed even if he had never seen it before, and behind him one of his men exhaled softly, the sound carrying a similar realization, and another adjusted his stance again, more at ease now but still attentive, and the man who had arrived watched the exchange without interruption. His expression unchanged but his presence slightly less rigid, as if the situation had moved into a different phase. One that no longer required intervention, and outside the engines that had been idling finally powered down, the low hum fading into the background, signaling without announcement that the urgency had passed, and inside the bar the atmosphere shifted with it, not returning to normal, not yet, but easing into something quieter, something more grounded, and Ryan stepped back half a pace, giving space where he had once taken it, the gesture small but intentional, and for the first time since the moment began, the room felt like it belonged to itself again, even as the weight of what had happened remained, settling into memory with a clarity none of them would forget. The tension did not snap, it thinned, stretching out across the room like a wire that had finally stopped pulling tighter, and for the first time since the moment had begun the small sounds of the bar started to return, not fully, not naturally, but cautiously, as if the space itself was testing whether it was allowed to breathe again, and Ryan Voss felt that shift as clearly as he had felt the pressure before it, the weight in his chest easing just enough to let clarity settle in, and he stepped back another half-pace without thinking, creating distance not out of fear but out of understanding, because the line that had been invisible earlier now stood unmistakable between him and the man at the bar, and he had no intention of crossing it again, and the old veteran remained seated, unchanged in posture, unchanged in presence, his hand resting lightly near the glass, his other hand folded near the worn jacket, the small card now tucked safely back where it belonged, and nothing about him suggested resolution or triumph, only stillness, the same quiet center he had held from the very beginning, and that was what lingered most in the room, not the arrival, not the recognition, but the realization that everything that had unfolded had been contained within that stillness all along, and the man who had arrived turned slightly, his attention shifting just enough to take in the rest of the room, not scanning for threats but acknowledging the people who had witnessed something they did not fully understand, and there was no announcement, no explanation offered, only a presence that made it clear that nothing further needed to be said, and one by one the men who had entered with him adjusted their stance, the tight formation easing into something less defined, not withdrawing but no longer holding the same readiness, and that subtle release carried through the room, allowing conversations to resume in low tones, glasses to touch the bar again, movements to return, though none of it felt quite the same as before, because something had been seen that could not be unseen, and Ryan remained still for a moment longer, his gaze lowering briefly to the counter before lifting again, not to challenge, not to question, but to take one last look at the man he had misjudged, committing that image to memory with a clarity that would not fade, and when he finally turned away it was deliberate, controlled, not retreating but stepping out of a space that had never been his to occupy, and his team followed without needing direction, their movements quieter now, more measured, as if each of them carried the same understanding in their own way, and near the edge of the room the bartender returned to her place behind the counter, her hand steady as she resumed wiping the surface, though her eyes lingered for just a moment longer on the old man before shifting away, not out of avoidance but out of respect for the boundary that had been revealed. And the man who had arrived took a final step closer to the bar, not imposing, not crowding, simply standing within a respectful distance, his voice low when he spoke again, meant only for the old veteran. "We will remain nearby," he said, and the old man gave a small nod in acknowledgement, nothing more, no further instruction needed, and outside the parking lot settled into quiet, the vehicles now still, their presence no longer urgent but constant, and inside the bar the night continued, slower, more aware, each person carrying with them the sense that something significant had passed through that space without spectacle, leaving behind not noise or disruption, but a quiet understanding that would remain long after the room returned to normal. The night did not end with a final word, it settled into a quieter rhythm, one that carried the weight of what had happened without needing to repeat it, and the bar slowly returned to motion, glasses lifted, conversations resumed in low tones, but every movement felt more measured, more aware, as if the room itself had learned something it could not quite explain, and at the counter the old man remained seated, the same as before, his presence unchanged, his glass untouched for a moment. Longer before he finally lifted it, taking a slow sip as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred, and that was what stayed with those who had witnessed it, not the arrival, not the salute, but the way he returned to stillness as though the moment had never been about him at all. And across the room Ryan Voss paused near the door, his hand resting briefly against the frame as he looked back one last time, not searching, not questioning, just observing, and in that look there was no trace of the certainty he had carried earlier, only a quiet recognition that some things existed beyond rank, beyond experience, beyond anything he had been trained to identify, and his team stood with him, silent, each man holding his own version of the same realization, not spoken, not shared, but understood, and one of them exhaled softly, almost a release, as if letting go of something they had not realized they were holding, and Ryan gave a small nod, not to anyone in particular, just a subtle acknowledgement of the shift that had taken place. And then he stepped outside, the cool night air meeting him with a clarity that felt sharper than before, the vehicles still parked in place, quiet now, their presence steady but no longer urgent, and inside the bar the man who had arrived remained only a moment longer, standing at a respectful distance, his posture relaxed but attentive, and when he finally turned to leave it was without ceremony, without announcement, his role complete not because something had ended, but because what needed to be recognized already had been, and the others followed in the same quiet manner, their departure leaving no disruption, only space, and when the door closed behind them the room seemed to settle fully for the first time, the tension gone but not forgotten, transformed into something quieter, something lasting, and the bartender glanced once more toward the old man before returning to her work, her movement steady, her expression thoughtful, because she understood now, in her own way, that what she had witnessed was not an exception but a reminder, and at the bar the old man set his glass down gently, his gaze drifting for a moment toward the door before returning to the quiet space in front of him, and there was no pride in it, no need to reflect, only the same calm presence he had carried from the beginning, the kind that did not demand attention but held it anyway, and as the night moved forward and the sounds of the bar grew more familiar, one truth remained beneath it all, unspoken but clear, that respect was never something proven in a moment, it was something carried, something earned long before anyone thought to question it, and sometimes the only sign of it was the silence it left behind.